Welcome to week 3 of Changing Church. You've made your way through the first 2 weeks and well done. But here we are at week 3 and we're looking at the wilderness and the neutral zone. Joining me here are 2 faces that you will know from weeks 1 and 2, and that's Elford and Megan Seneque. And we're going to have a chat, and it really is going to be a chat, about life in the neutral zone, life in the wilderness, what it was like for the Israelites, and also how they made their way through into the promised land. So let's start with a question about what are the qualities that you think are needed to get through the wilderness experience and to be that community of God and on into the promised land. What's it like in the wilderness from your experience?
Well, I was thinking when we were talking about this before that one of the issues, I think, is that the Israelites or if you're in the situation like the Israelites, you kind of need to understand what the situation is. If all your energy is on and all your focus is on where you're going to be in the future, then there's a real risk that everything that happens on the way becomes a kind of irritation or a problem or a difficulty. There's something about recognizing that you're in it for the long haul, that it's not all going to happen in a hurry. So there's something about recognizing that this is an opportunity, that the journey is actually a key part of the process. And I think when we discussed this before, we agree that the sense that the journey is as important as the destination is crucial here.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's difficult. So one believes that one has landed somewhere and this is the answer, and we've now reached a transformed state of some kind. And the transformational process itself is the point, if you know what I mean. So the notion of journeying and shedding along the way those things that are not useful and that are no longer necessary for your own transformation is a necessary part. So accepting that, to use the eye of the needle metaphor, there's a whole lot of stuff that we carry that we don't realize actually is a burden rather than a blessing when it comes to embarking on transformational change processes. And so that notion of shedding and letting go and being comfortable with that is something of what this working through a threshold, this working in the wilderness, if you like, what it means.
So to pick up that letting go again, very, very important in the theory U that we looked at last week, isn't it, that letting go? So in your experience, what sort of thing might that be?
Well, I think we often carry with us a whole lot of assumptions around how things ought to be, how we ought to be. And some of that, what that letting go means is suspending your usual desire to solve a problem, to offer solutions, to drive towards a particular outcome. That's a very natural human tendency. Well, we know the answer, and this is what it is. And it's actually to suspend one's usual ways of knowing, because I think what this invitation is to become something other than who we are. So that shifting perception is not an easy thing. It needs an acknowledgement that some of your assumptions are unhelpful, some of your ways of seeing are counterproductive, and very often they're not inclusive. So we focus very much on ourselves rather than seeing ourselves as part of a whole. And I think that's what this invitation to is as well.
So your questions are different.
Yes.
The questions that you ask in the wilderness are very different to other places.
I think that's right. I mean, people don't always want to do it, though.
No.
And I guess you see some of that in the Israelite story, the confusion, the anger, the wanting to go back, even though only 5 minutes ago, apparently Egypt was the worst place ever. Yes. Suddenly it's very attractive. Yeah. There are got flesh pots. We hadn't heard, we don't remember these flesh pots from anything earlier, but anyway. But I think part of it is, I mean, I think we've made this point before, but I'll emphasise again that, you know, this is not just a change of geography. This is not just a move from one place to another place. This is a move from one way of being to another way of being. So it's a journey of becoming, and it has implications for everybody. And so the journey is about the internal change, and this is the transition point that Bridges makes, isn't it? That, you know, it's not just an external change; it's an internal change. Now, my experience is that quite often people think that they can make an organisational change without that kind of internal change. So, an example, you asked for an example.
Yes, please. My next question.
Some years ago, I was working with a bishop's staff team in a diocese, which I will not name, in the UK. And the objective of the exercise was to develop a strategy for the diocese, working with the bishop's staff team. But the process stalled about halfway through, and we were finding it very, very difficult to get them to engage fully with the process. Now, I've remained quite good friends with one of the members of that team, and he told me some years later that the difficulty was, the reason why it stalled and the reason why it didn't go anywhere was because they began to realise that they weren't going to be able to effect this change or develop this strategy without changing themselves. And basically they bottled out of it. That was his account of what happened. And it did make a certain sense looking back on it. And I think that's quite common. I think there's this expectation, this idea that we can make all these changes which look like, if you like, external changes. We'll take on this activity, we'll do that activity, without the internal change that goes with it, which isn't only about letting go of the past. It is partly about that. But it's also about becoming and operating in a different way, which you can't do without changing inside. And people often don't want to do that.
So there's a sense in which people have to feel so uncomfortable with the way that their present structures and their present communities are working, that actually the only thing you can do is to then go into change and that inner psychological transition. Is that right?
I think that Bridges says something to that effect, doesn't he? I think he says.
He does.
I think he says something. You know, that he says that, you know, the problems in the early stages of change, problems are your friend. I think he uses a phrase like that.
That's right.
Because it makes the need for change clear and works against people reverting to their kind of comfort zone. I think that's right. I think, you know, if we're looking for a role for leadership in this, we've said on a previous occasion, it's not about solving all the problems. It's not about saying we're going to go here, we're going to do that, we're going to do that, we're going to do that, we're going to do this, and that's it. Everything will be nice. I think sometimes it's about saying, look, we've got to do something. You know, we can't go on like this. You know, we can't carry on in Israel making bricks.
In Egypt.
Egypt. Sorry. In Egypt. We can't go on in Egypt making bricks, can
that's
we?
right.
We've got to be somewhere else, and something's got to change. So I think that's an important role for leaders. Voicing that dissatisfaction and to a certain extent pointing it up. And
actually, I would think it's part of the process itself, that coming to recognise that there is a crack, if you like, in the system, that there are things that need to be addressed. Not so much for the leaders to point it out, but for people to create the conditions for people to have an experience of that. So that they come to the realization themselves, because then it actually becomes a collective responsibility and ownership. And that's how leadership then emerges throughout the system, and people take on leadership roles wherever they are. So I think a lot of it is about building containers. It's about building containers so that people feel safe. And creating the conditions for different kinds of relationships to emerge. So I think that the leadership challenge is creating conditions for other kinds of connections to be made and different relationships to be forged. So it's very much a relational matter. It means you're paying attention to very different things than you might otherwise ordinarily do.
Yes. You know, I have a lot of sympathy for the Israelites because they'd been brought on this journey, and they'd come, and that was great. But then they get there, and quite early on they go to the place called Elim, which is rather beautiful because it has 7 springs. And so the temptation for them to sort of say, oh, this is it.
This is nice.
Yes, absolutely. This is it. This is great. This is
like this.
clearly the promised land. We've got water. We can, have our animals and that sort of thing. What would you say to that?
Well, I think you have the issue is recognizing, that you're in a long game here, and not being too quick to see, a nice sort of oasis on the way as the place to get to. But that's a matter, again, I guess that's a matter of discernment, because when you're actually in it, maybe you do think this is perhaps the promised land. So I think there is, I guess there's something about, a degree of rigor in thought about that, I think.
And leadership again.
And not being too willing to, to kind of, not being too quick to look for the kind of way out. But it's tempting, isn't it?
It is.
Terribly tempting.
Well, and I think people find uncertainty, particularly sustained uncertainty, very hard. So I remember working in the transition to post-apartheid South Africa in a university context where we were talking about transforming higher education, for example. And I'll never forget, so working very closely with the Vice-Chancellor on how do you create the conditions for a learning organisation to emerge and transformational change. And I remember one of the heads of department saying, well, when will we be transformed? And the Vice-Chancellor saying, but the transformational process is that is the transformational work. And so people get, well, but we've now got a structure in place, and what's wrong with this, and why can't we settle here? It's a natural human response because people don't like ambiguity and uncertainty. So if you create the conditions to normalize uncertainty in some way, so that people realize that the ongoing learning, relating, and responding is actually the transformational process. That's the rigor that's required. And it requires a very different attention and intention.
I mean, I guess as well, part of the issue here is that, in a sense, there isn't an arrival anyway. I mean, yes, there comes a point where they will reach the promised land and they will fight their way into Canaan. But it's not like a simple point where they've been on a journey and then they arrive and then it's all right. The journey in a sense goes on, but the transformation continues to go on, and they don't live up to the expectations that they've set for themselves and God has set for them, and that becomes an ongoing narrative, and kind of we're still in it, really. We're still living that story now. And I think it's one of our fonder hopes that we have as humans, that there'll come a point where we're over this hump, this change, this difficulty, and we can kind of go, oh, phew. I mean, this happened again and again with the Sisters of Nazareth. You get this thing, you get them feeling, are we through this now? Is it done now? Can we stop this now? And of course the answer is no, because you never can.
No.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there are times and seasons of larger change and where it's more intense and so on, and there are periods of something that looks a bit more like consolidation. But that sense that the world doesn't stand still, it's always there.
Yeah.
Always there.
Yeah. Let's look for a moment at the place of reflective practice or reflection in these processes. Because, we in the wilderness, we get lots of conversation, which is great, because that's between the Israelites, Moses and Aaron, and God. And so you have lots of that. And do you need to do that in the midst of a change process that's going to really bring about transformation? What's the significance of reflection in the process?
Well, you've connected it already with dialogue and conversation.
Yeah.
And what I observe is that I think we're much better at reflecting on the past. So reflection that is, traditional Kolb's learning cycle and learning modes that are actually a reflection on the past, learning from the past. I think we're much less attuned to how we might lean our way into a future that is not yet here, that is something other than a repetition of the past. So I think that reflective practices that actually tune us into relating differently to one another, and dialogue is a key vehicle for that. So almost a dialogic way of being in the world. So you're listening to one another in a different way. You're listening to what comes at you from the universe and why time and nature and all of that, I mean, and which is why it's so significant for this, what we're talking about here, is we tend to disconnect. So this connection with one another, connection with ourselves, connection with one another, connection with the natural world, and then listening in a different way, so that we can actually lean into another kind of future and have that as an ongoing stance in the world, what Richard Rohr would call action and contemplation.
Yes.
So you're holding a contemplative stance rather than going, well, I'm going to stop now to reflect. It actually becomes much more an embodied way of being and becoming, because that's where we can then create futures that we don't yet know that are other than a repetition of the past.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, doing something really new is always a huge challenge, isn't it? And it brings with it so many uncertainties and feelings that are difficult to manage and so on. So I think, I mean, I'm not sure if this is reflective practice exactly, but I do think continuing to talk about what's going on is really important. And that ability to listen to other people is crucial, because if we reflect on what Bridges calls the neutral zone, or if we look at the change curve, the Kubler-Ross piece of work, which really brings home the emotional challenge that any significant change brings, but a change of this transformational level is likely to bring quite intensely, where you've got those intense emotions of anger and grief and so forth, and indeed can be right down into the pit of despair. I think part of how we deal with this is A, we expect that to happen, and B, we keep talking to each other and we keep listening to each other and we give permission for those feelings, but we refrain also from trying to solve them. Because you can't,
Yes.
So
Yes.
you hear them, and I always think of that when when the Israelites are really angry at Meribah, isn't it? I think of that. This is this classic change curve kind of stuff, and they're going down the curve, going down it, and they don't have any kind of insight really into what's going on. So I think one of the things that we can do is have the insight that these things are going to happen, and maybe the wit and the wisdom to encourage the kind of conversation, the kind of self-reflection and so on, which allows people to say, okay, oh right, that's where we are.
That's where we are.
We're there.
That's what's happening.
Yes.
Yes.
And I think, you can't just take it away. You've kind of got to go through it, but I think it can really help having that insight.
Do you think there's a purpose to the grumbling? I mean, the Israelites do a lot of grumbling, and with some justification. They haven't got enough to eat and drink. But that may well happen in some places in the world today, of course. But the grumbling, what's the purpose behind it? And how does a leader deal with
I think it's a necessary part of the change process as well. So there's a beautiful book by Peter Block called Community, the Structure of Belonging. And he says dissent is incredibly important. You have to know what you're assenting to. And dissent is a necessary part of the process. So I think very often in change processes we try and make things nice and we try and make them tidy. And try and give easy answers and reassure people when in fact they often have legitimate concerns which don't respond well, for good reason, to platitudes and reassurance. So that notion of heartfelt dissent in order to give heartfelt assent to something is a critical part of these processes. And I think the desire to be nice and to make it an easy ride actually does transformational change a disservice. And it's often what blocks then if you think about the movement of the U, what stops the movement of the other side is that when you innovate, and we're talking about bringing something new into the world, it requires a different kind of openness. So that openness of mind, heart, and will is an ongoing movement, because things will close you off at different points. So I think that there's an ongoing discernment and attention that requires keeping that openness and that allows dissent to be a legitimate part of the movement.
I think another factor in this is that change as an idea is one thing. Change as an experience is another. And I think what one sees in the story is that, they're in a situation which they don't like, which is painful for them in Egypt, and they're offered a way out of it, and that seems exciting, I assume. And they have this spectacular initial experience of the plagues and the parting of the Red Sea. And one can imagine that would be very exciting, but they probably haven't really considered before then in any great depth what the actual journey is therefore afterwards going to be like. And I think change experiences are often like that. So if I go back to the sisters once again, in the early stages where we were exploring their purpose, and we were thinking about what their future could look like and what changes they might need to make to be able to do that and so on, people found that quite engaging. They got into that, and and one could have imagined it was going to be straightforward after that easily, because there was a lot of energy and enthusiasm. But then you get to the point where people actually have to start doing things differently, and it's not like it was before. And some of it's uncomfortable. So suddenly their houses, which they've had free reign in and they've run without anybody else involved for a long time, I've got other people in them doing things, other professional people, and you've got maybe IT people coming and tearing the place apart and putting in new wiring and telling them where they can and can't plug things in and all that, and what their email protocols must be and so forth. And they're adapting to a slightly different, less hands-on role and a more governance-based role. And at that point, they suddenly decide they don't like it all that much after all. Some of them, some people do. And for some of them, the change is just too difficult. And actually, that remained the case. In some small pockets, there were people who just couldn't get with it, couldn't do it. And actually, even putting it that way is not fair. To talk about it as if it's about getting with it or doing it, or that there's some deficiency on their part in not living up to some ideal, that's not very helpful either. Because it is about what you've just said. It's about actually getting all that stuff on the table and working through it. Because that's what, you can't do that usually until you're in it. You can't do it in advance.
And that's about finding the new identity, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that's why you have to go through a wilderness.
Yeah.
And that time of disruption, which is a word we use quite a lot, that disruption, so that we're looking for a new identity. It's a time of discernment from the 9 principles and practices, and it's all of those sorts of things. A few last comments just before we finish the discussion.
Oh, you want us to make it?
Yes. Yeah, not me. Sorry about that.
I thought you were about to say something.
No.
Well,
No, I was asking you.
Interesting. I was thinking again as listening to Keith. If you think of Fritjof Capra, who wrote the book Web of Life. So if we're working from the premise that we are all deeply interconnected, in ways that we don't always realize or understand, when you create the conditions for connection to happen at multiple levels, not just with one another, but with oneself, understanding who I am from an identity perspective, what is my work, my calling, that is an ongoing process, and being attentive to that is important. And then just linking to Capra would say, well, we are always in the free fall of change. Change is a constant, so we talk about... The point is, change is a constant, and how we respond to it and creating the conditions for a different way of responding to change is what this is an invitation to. And he would say resistance to change is not a problem. It's simply a response to change.
Yes.
So we all respond to change
Yes.
differently. How do you create the conditions for that to become a generative response rather than a negative response? But resistance is a natural response to the free fall of change. How do we work with that so that it becomes a movement where personal change and communal change can be mutually informing and mutually reinforcing processes to an unknown destination? And it doesn't mean you don't have anchor points along the way. This doesn't mean that we...
It's not just a free-for-all.
It's not a free-for-all.
No.
There are anchor points
Yeah.
that enable people to feel safe. That's when I use the language of building a container.
Yeah.
So that leadership can emerge across the system. So it's not just the leaders. It's actually that there is emerging leadership where people step up and take responsibility for their role and the purpose of the whole.
Can you say just a little bit more about when you say building a container? What might that look like in practice?
Well, in practice, from my perspective, so a recent project that I was involved in South Africa was really challenging economic systems and structures in developing countries. So it's called Wellbeing Economies. It was a lab. So it's called a lab intentionally because it was a year-long innovation lab, and we had a lot of participants from across 8 countries. And we were inviting them to do local innovations around different forms of economic systems and economic structures. And we created a container for them over the course of a year. So we had 3 face-to-face sessions with them where we introduced them to dialogic practices. We took them through a U process. We allowed them to challenge themselves, challenge each other, and go through the change process in a way.
Yeah.
And then they went and practiced that in their home contexts.
Okay, so it's about you modelled something which they could then take back to their locations.
We gave them a deep experience of something. Yeah. So there were multiple little journeys within it. So we held a journey for a container for all 28 participants over the year. And then they built and held containers in their local contexts for transformational change, particularly around communities involved with giving substance to the whole notion of greening the economy. What does that really mean if you're challenging governance and decision-making structures and systems, and when you're in institutional arrangements where this is incredibly hard? So we had participants who were working with the ILO, who were working in difficult institutional circumstances. It was building a container for them to work through their own challenges, which inevitably you face because it's not an easy process with easy answers.
Yeah. And I love your description of anchor points in the wilderness, because the Sabbath is the major anchor point. On the 7th day you will rest, and there is manna and quail for 2 days, but don't try to preserve it.
But you can't stop, can you, in the sense that people sometimes want to. It's amazing, isn't it? Change is such a feature of life. I mean, and it wouldn't exist without change. And it changes all the time, and yet we still struggle with it. And we're always trying to stop the world, as it were. All of us, I do it, all the time.
All the time.
So there's a psychological challenge, but I guess, I mean, we shouldn't neglect the extent to which this is a spiritual challenge, in the sense that this is a challenge to trust God through a process of becoming.
Yeah.
And it will mean letting go of some of the things that we think define us, but which actually don't define us. And it will be going, so it's a journey of discovery with God. It's a process of experimentation. It's a process of finding out. It's not that God changes, it's not that the gospel changes, but it is that some of the ways that we're used to living it out or expressing it will no longer be valid or no longer seem right or no longer seem useful. So it's about rediscovering who we are and the way we are. Now that is deeply challenging, and it's challenging for everybody. So if you're the pastor or the minister, it's going to be as challenging, if not more so for you. Don't think you can stand apart from this. I hope we've made that point a few times.
Yes.
It's for all of us, but it's about discovering something together. And I think we've understandably emphasised the elements of loss, of difficulty and painfulness, but actually there's also discovery and excitement and fun and trying things out. And your phrase is prototyping, I think. You know, I mean,
Surprises.
Yeah. Trying things. Okay, that seems to have some promising angles to it. Let's refine that, let's try that again. Or maybe that didn't work. Let's leave that then. You know, there's that. You know, let's see it as you know, a process in which there are really exciting discoveries and, as you say, surprises. Things we had no idea were going to happen.
Yeah.
And we find God in surprising places as well. I mean, I think we have this idea that we've got to generate it all from within our own resources. But do you know what? And, you know, I know that people have differing theologies on this. But, you know, God is out there too. God has gone before us.
Yes.
So we may well find that God comes to us in some surprising ways. And I think, although I can't put my finger on an instance at the moment, there are, in the Exodus story, there are examples of that. Or maybe it's the experience a bit later where they go into the promised land, and I'm thinking of the surprising help they get from the prostitute Rahab.
Indeed, that's right.
Where, you
the
know,
walls of Jericho.
who
Yes.
is a surprising
Yes.
instrument
Yes.
of God,
Yes.
you would think.
Yes.
So
Yes.
I think it just, things like that just kind of demonstrate that it's not just about us. It's about, and it's about God, and it's about what God can do through other people as well in other circumstances.
Megan and Keith, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, participants, and we'll see you next week for week 4.